I think we can clap a little louder than that. Let's go. How's it going? I needed that. All right, so welcome to ranked choice voting on the rise. We're going to get into what ranked choice voting is, just in case anybody knows in just a moment, but I want to introduce you to your incredible panelists really quickly. To my right, we have Mike Griffin. Mike Griffin is an organizer from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Started his organizing career on a little campaign in 2008 for a senator from Illinois named Barack Obama. Worked in a number of states, but over the past 24 hours has reminded me one of them was Wisconsin. Mike has worked as youth director for Minnesotans United for All Families, which achieved marriage equality in Minnesota. And he also worked with FairVote Minnesota to educate voters in 2013 when Minneapolis used ranked choice voting in their municipal elections, and has continued doing incredible organizing work in the city ever since. Now to my left, we have Evan McMullin, who is the co-founder of Stand Up Republic. Previously, he was an independent candidate for president in the 2016 election. Before launching his campaign, he was the chief policy director for the House Republican Conference and served as senior advisor to the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And before that, was working with the CIA's National Clandestine Service as an operations officer. To my far left, we have Maria Perez, who is the campaign's manager for Common Cause New Mexico. Before joining Common Cause, she was the director of FairVote New Mexico, where she helped to implement ranked choice voting in Santa Fe when they used it for the first time in March of 2018. She recently worked with the City Council of Las Cruces, New Mexico, to adopt ranked choice voting, which they'll be using this November. And before that, she has a 20-year career of incredible organizing on a variety of issues, but always focused on equitable policy. To my right, we have Alan Schwartz. Mr. Schwartz is the executive chairman at Guggenheim Partners since 2009. He's the former chief executive officer at Bear Stearns, and previously worked in various capacities with Wortham & Company and R.W. Prestwich & Company. He has a number of interests, and among them, he works at the National Mentoring Partnership, American Foundation for AIDS Research, NYU Langhorne Medical Center, and is on the board of a number of other organizations, which are all very exciting. So with no further ado, we're going to get started with this conversation. And I like to always start by understanding kind of the perspectives that we come to this reform from, because I think we all have different stories, but we ended up in the same place, and it's good to know why. So starting with Maria on my left, what led you here? Why ranked choice voting? Why now?
Thank you, Grace, and thank you everybody for being here today. I grew up in Ecuador, in South America, in a place where voting is compulsory. You have to vote. And this is the way that I thought things were. I immigrated to the States as a teenager and quickly learned that that's not the case here. Like Grace mentioned, my work really was on health policy and equitable policy for many, many, many years. But always in the back of my mind was this issue of why people don't vote here. What can we do about that? And through my work on health equity issues like housing, like transit, like education, like peace promotion, and economic development, you know, there's this issue about, like, we can't get those policies passed or good policies passed when we don't have good elected people in office, and we can't get good elected people in office when people don't vote, and we can't get people to vote if we don't have a good system to include people and get them excited about voting and make them feel that their vote counts. So this is all brewing in the back of my head, and then following the 2016 presidential election, I felt very strongly that our democracy was definitely in danger, and that I needed to take sort of like a step back from my career and dedicate my time to doing democracy work as opposed to health equity work. Because if we don't have a democracy, I feel like all these other things that I've been working on, like we're never going to get there. We need to have a strong democracy in place so that people will vote, that their elected officials will represent them, and that we can get these policies passed. So this is what brought me to this movement of ranked choice voting specifically, is this desire to really strengthen our democracy. And I was living in Oakland at the time where they had ranked choice voting. It made perfect sense to me, and it was a no-brainer. I had to do this, and I've been doing this for maybe 3 years now.
Thank you. You know, I'm so pleased to be here, and thank you to represent us and Grace and to all of you for being here too, to be a part of this conversation. You know, for me, coming from a national security background, you know, I look at the polarization in our country, and I'm sure many of you have seen the Pew data that shows the parties moving farther away from each other since 2004. For the longest time, they were overlapping ideologically, and now they're both moving towards their fringes. And we can spend a lot of time talking about that. But extreme polarization in our country, I see as frankly, as a national security threat to us. And our adversaries, by the way, agree. They're trying to stoke these divisions and turn us against each other even more. And in that context, you know, we start to enter this post-truth world in which, you know, there are no facts, there is no evidence, there's just power, and might makes right, and chaos. And so I look at ranked choice voting as a way to counter that. And there are many things, of course, that need to be done, but one of them is ensuring that our incentives reward unifying and effective leadership, and that our incentives will pull us back together. The incentives of our electoral processes will help pull our country back together and reward leaders who identify, protect, and grow common ground, which I think ranked choice voting is a system that can allow that to happen, and that can cause that to happen. More to say about that, but in a nutshell, that's what drives me on this side.
And once again, I am Mike Griffin from Minneapolis, Minnesota. What brings me here? I started my career working for Barack Obama, trying to get black people to vote. How to get black and brown people to vote. That drives me here. And I'm from Minneapolis, where we traditionally have had two different elections. One election in August, one election in November. The August election, traditionally, has been typically older, richer, white people. People who look opposite of me. Those folks had the option to show up in August. They showed up in August and they narrowed the field down to two candidates. Those two candidates then went on to the general election, where people like me show up to vote. Unfortunately, by the time they made it to November, those folks were only given two options to pick from. So we ended that in Minneapolis. We have one election. That primary election that nobody showed up for, that was high cost, we got rid of. We got rid of it. We have one big election in November where we have the most diverse city council in America. Woo! And this is not just diversity when it comes to just age or gender. We have a trans man, a trans woman, first ever Somali elected in American history, Hmong, black people. Like the amount of diversity that's on our Minneapolis City Council is something that I'm proud of. So having worked for Barack Obama, now working for ranked choice voting, it makes me excited that we finally have a voting method that can give more choice and more power to people of color. This is the voting method that will actually help get more folks to vote. This is it. I thank Unrig for inviting us here, and I think that there's a lot of different election reforms that can happen. A lot of them. But none will be as important as us fundamentally changing elections, and ranked choice voting is a way to do that.
How many of you would like to follow that? It's an honor to be here, and I came here from a different path as one of those old white guys. And, I'm a recovering research director and economist, and so in the work I was doing going back now 10 plus years, I started to become increasingly concerned about the trends in our economy of unequal outcomes, where the growth in the economy and was not being shared by enough of the population, and I felt like that was not a sustainable issue, and it was something that needed to be addressed. If we could get out in front of it, there were policies to deal with it. So I started going to Washington, I started talking to policymakers, and it became very frustrating when you realized you could go and have these policy discussions with Democrats, with Republicans. You would find there was a lot of actual intellectual overlap between the two. And then when you start to talk about, okay, so what kinds of laws could be passed or regulations to be done, the answer was none, because the process was broken. And so, I just sat there contemplating that, and after a while I said, why sit here and discuss policy when policy doesn't matter? And that gets right into the incentive system that's being talked about. And so I tried to look for it, came across RepresentUs, I joined the board and said, let's really focus. And then I also got started with Michael Porter and Catherine Gell, who wrote a great report about the duopoly taking over our election system. So we spent a lot of time, and in their report they have the overlap between the impactful and the possible. What could change and what would have a big impact. And we came to ranked choice voting. And it's really about, we'll talk about it, but it's getting rid of this incentive system that says, I need to not be unseated in my primary. In most of these districts, I can win the general as long as I can get through the primary. And one thing I'll say slightly there, the makeup of the primary is mostly about people who will turn out over an issue. So there are certain one-issue, groups and each wing that can energize voters to show up and unseat somebody in the primary if they ever go against them. And that creates that tremendous polarization in Congress. And ranked choice to us is the one way to break through that.
So I want to quickly make sure we haven't accidentally left anybody behind, and I'm going to put my colleague Maria on the spot very quickly. Just in case anybody isn't familiar, in 30 seconds or less, can you tell me what ranked choice voting is?
Why, indeed I can. So ranked choice voting is a simple change to our voting system, which allows you, when you get your ballot, instead of just marking one candidate as like your zero-sum, this guy against everybody else, you get to rank all the candidates in order of preference. In that sense, you are marking your backup choices already if your favorite candidate doesn't win. If on election day, everybody's first choice votes are counted, and if somebody wins the majority of the vote, that's great. If they don't, the candidate that receives the least number of first choice votes is eliminated. And if your favorite candidate is eliminated, then your vote automatically gets counted as your second choice, right? So your vote is never wasted, and you always get a majority winner with the broadest support from voters. How's that?
It sounds like she's done that before.
If you're wondering why her answer was so good, it's because she had that question in advance. Transparency.
So I want to dive in on a few of the things that I heard kind of throughout the different perspectives that we hear of what got us here. And one thing I think we can agree on is it seems like the system that we have, whether we're talking about the primaries, whether we're talking about the general election, it seems like we have a system that's really built for two candidates, but that also doesn't seem like our political reality. So since we have someone who's run as an independent, since we have somebody who kind of went against that norm, Evan, I was wondering if you could talk about what it's like to run as an independent candidate or a third-party candidate, and how our system reacts to that sort of candidate, and how ranked choice voting could create a different dynamic.
Yeah, I think the main thing is, the current system essentially sets up a spoiler situation. So if somebody is running outside of the two major parties, either as an independent or a third-party candidate, then the way many voters look at them and their candidacy is as a less viable and likely spoiler of the election, because, for example, if an independent is running, and I think most people in the room understand this, an independent or a third-party person is running, and if I'm going to cast my vote for them, even though they're my preferred candidate, perhaps, that may cause the candidate I least want to win to actually win the election. And so as a result of that, of that spoiler effect. I'm instead going to choose the lesser of two evils that have a chance to, what I perceive to be a greater chance of winning. And so that's the dynamic, and that makes it very hard for third-party and independent candidates. But I also think it just simply, I mean, forget about those independent candidates and the third-party candidates. It just doesn't serve the country well to have a system in which we have only candidates emerging from only two parties, from only two primary processes, and you have to choose one or the other. And I think that closed system is anathema to sort of the rest of our lives and the rest of the experience of life in America, where we just have more choices about everything. And it also sets up this dynamic where it's sort of, you're not trying to appeal to and bring the country to a higher place and reach to a higher place, a more unifying place as a country. Really, what you're trying to do is just be less bad than the other one. And that sort of creates this more polarization, which I talk a lot about, and more division in the country. And I think you have leadership that ends up being severely lacking on really every metric, whether it's sort of fitness or moral grounding or integrity or just knowledge, you name it. But those are the incentives that I think we have to move past, and I think ranked choice voting is able to help us with that.
I heard the word incentives. I think that's something that we should be talking about a little bit more. Maria, you talked about when you came here, it seemed like people didn't vote. What are the things that incentivize voters to vote, and what isn't working right now, and how can ranked choice voting impact that?
I think this is a really interesting question, because I think in a country like ours, with so many cultures and so many different people, we can't have a generalized answer to that. The different cultures, different ages get incentivized by different things to vote. So I think we need to think about that. And it's not just the blanket solution to canvass and door knock and pin people so many times and make sure that they have a right to the polls. Like, there's more to it than that. And I think that one of the main things that incentivizes people to not just vote, but to be engaged in the democratic process is to have a belief that your voice is going to be heard and that your voice matters, and that we actually live in a representative democracy, that your elected folks are going to listen to you and are going to represent your interests. That is not the kind of system we have now. You can, as an organizer, I can mobilize 1,000 calls to a city council member, and they still don't care, right? They're not beholden to their constituents. They're sort of beholden to other interests. So I think, to answer your question, the main incentive to get people to vote is to foment a belief that their vote counts to begin with, and then all the other things where I'm sure that many people in the audience here work on this, is just like making it easier for people to vote and breaking down some of those barriers. Like the voter suppression, or just like no early voting, and purging of voter rolls and all these things. But having a voice that counts, that's the ticket, and ranked choice voting gets there.
So let's talk about a flip side of incentives. We have a seasoned organizer over here with a lot of campaigns under his belt. I know for a fact you've run a canvass because I've been your canvasser before. What changes for candidates with ranked choice voting? What are those incentives?
So yeah, when I organized for Obama, it was back in 07, 08. It was Barack Obama versus Hillary Clinton versus John Edwards. And anytime we knocked on a door and they said they were voting for either Hillary Clinton or John Edwards, guess what I was telling would do?
Bye.
Thank you, have a good day. I would go to the next door because time is important. And we need time, and you gotta go find more voters and go register more people. Because if you liked an opponent and you're gonna go vote for that opponent, that ended the conversation. So not only does ranked choice voting allow more candidates to run, it encourages more candidates to run, it's actually, while you are campaigning, the actual act of you organizing, how you campaign, being a campaign manager and a field director on campaigns, is fundamentally different. And it actually is better for voters. Because if you tell me that you're voting for my opponent, that doesn't end the conversation as it did in 08. In Minneapolis, if you tell me that you're voting for my opponent, I'm asking, what issues do you care about? And then I'm trying to link my candidate to the issues that you care about. That incentivizes voters that we're actually talking about issues that they care about. So it helps out candidates to run more office, to run. It helps out when you're actually campaigning. And then actually when you win. Now after you're governing, you actually are governing for the majority. More candidates run. While you are campaigning, it's fundamentally different. And then once you get in, you actually want to make laws to help out everybody because you want to get reelected. In Minneapolis and St. Paul, so Minneapolis has one of the most diverse city councils in America, one. And we have one of the most progressive legislations that are actually getting things done. $15 an hour passed in Minneapolis and St. Paul, one of the only cities in the Midwest, the only cities to do it since Trump was president. Minneapolis and St. Paul, and that is only because we have people that are in office that actually want to get shit done. And the reason that they want to get shit done is because they were elected under race racism.
Is that a technical term?
I don't know. Is that?
Yes, it's a technical term. So we're talking about governing now, right? We talked about the process for the voters, for the candidates, but now you get elected under this system. We're talking about how does this change accountability? How does this change governance? What are the incentives there? Alan, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I think everything you've been hearing focuses on that, because right now, when you're in office, all you really have to do is make sure, and we have 30% of the population who believes our government is doing well for the people, but you have like 80% or some number of that people get reelected because they're in safe districts. So you get to incentive system, the only incentive you have is to make sure that you take care of the people that show up in the primaries, and they will unseat you if you would go across the aisle and do something they don't like. So the two parties have not only taken over our entire system, but the two wings of the parties have taken over the parties. And so the governing incentives are not to upset the wing. I'll give you an example. Joe Lieberman in Connecticut, he managed to go across the aisle, and even as a well-known senator, he got knocked out in his Democratic primary in a Democratic state, but he was so well known that he ran as an independent. As an independent, he trounced his opponent, which was very clear that what the bulk of the population in Connecticut wanted from their senator was go get things done, but he would have been knocked out in his primary. Now, the only reason he could do that was because he wasn't in a state where there was this sore loser, where the two parties in some states say if you lose your primary, you are not allowed to run as an independent. Think about that. Why would a party not want you to have a chance to run as an independent? It's their incentive system to say you better stick with us.
How many states have those laws?
Well, only 44. 44 states in this country have sore loser laws, which just, if you stop and think about it, it's making sure that you know that when you're in that seat, you better not upset your party's wing.
Can I build on that a little bit? So Alan's comments are so important, and that is what the incentives are if you're a candidate. And for the longest time, first, of course, you were focused as a candidate on getting through a primary if you're not an independent, if you're with one of the parties. And so that makes sense, you sort of appeal to the base of the party, but not so much that if you win the primary, you can't tack back towards in a direction that's more unifying, and that's what's required in a race that's even somewhat competitive for you to win. And that process of tacking to a more unifying place in the general election, I think was important for the health of our country, because then the idea was you get some buy-in from people in the other party, some independents, and you build this coalition for your candidacy and for your leadership that you then use to govern. But we've now entered this phase where even in some competitive elections, candidates will look at the two parties and they'll say, we're so far apart from each other, there's no way a unifying campaign can win, it's certainly not going to win the primary, and I'm not actually going to be able to be in a unifying place in the general and keep my base. So now the game is even shifted in even some competitive races where now you run in the primary to mobilize the base, and you go as far as you can, basically, to excite and mobilize your primary base, your party base. And then in the general election, instead of providing unifying leadership and building that cross-partisan coalition for your leadership, instead it's just a get out the vote effort for your base, and it's just continuing on with this divisive approach. And it's tearing the country apart. And what ranked choice voting would allow is, allowing you as a voter, allowing us to fully express our preferences in a ranked sort of way, something that is not foreign to the way we live our lives. We rank all kinds of things in our lives. And that means that candidates all of a sudden have an incentive to demonstrate, to embrace, to grow, to protect common ground that I believe exists, because I don't think we as a country are as divided as the parties and some in the media would lead us to believe. I don't believe it. But the system right now helps create and protect division and obscure common ground that I think is there.
So I want to really briefly give a concrete example of how ranked choice voting has changed governance in my city of Santa Fe. Before 2018, we had a plurality voting system, which means that the candidate that got the most votes wins, regardless if that's well below a majority of the vote. And since ranked choice voting, now we have a majority winner. Now, we had 5 mayoral candidates last year, and after the election night, the first choice votes were counted, and Alan Weber, who is now the mayor, had 39% of the vote. So under the old system, he would have won that race with 39% of the vote. That's fine, right? But with ranked choice voting, after 4 rounds of counting, he actually won that race with 66% of the vote, right? So that makes a huge difference. And I've had a conversation with Mayor Weber about this, whereas, he now feels like he has a mandate, and he does. And the people of Santa Fe, even if he wasn't their first choice, even if he wasn't their second choice, they might have been their third choice, people have investment in him succeeding because they voted for him. Even if he was the favorite candidate, they wanted him to win above somebody else, right? So now he's been able to do all kinds of amazing things in the city. He holds city council meetings all over the city, where those 39% of the vote were concentrated in 2 districts, right? The rest that took him to 66% are from all over the city. He is governing for the whole city, and it just shows. It shows in his decision making, it shows in the way that he goes about it, it shows in how he schedules time to talk to constituents all over the city. It's a small city of 80,000 people. It's made a huge difference, and I see it as a resident of that city. I see it every day in the way that the government of our city has changed because of ranked choice voting, and it's only been one year since that election. It's been remarkable.
All right, so now I have a ton of questions from the audience, so I'm going to dive in there. The first one, I think Mike may have heard before, so I'm going to direct this one at you. It seems like RCV might be confusing for voters. Is it?
Absolutely not. It is as easy as 1, 2, 3. I mean, we all make decisions, right? We all make decisions. We all are ranked throughout our daily lives. And it's taking what we do naturally in our daily lives and just moving it into the voting booth. If your favorite candidate is not going to win, who's going to be your second choice? If the person that you love is not going to win, who do you like? And we have seen this work across all demographics. Education levels, race levels, gender, like everybody gets it, they like it, and they do it. And one of the big questions, and as we continue to develop this in more and more cities, is that we have the blueprint. Like, this has been tested and proven, that as we continue to expand this, the thought of communities of color might be might not be able to use it, might be too confusing for people. That is offensive. It's outright offensive. And when they try to use those arguments, call them on it. And you can also email me, find me on Facebook. And I'll tell you.
Thanks, Mike. That got better over time. So somebody called me. I'm not giving enough background in my intro, and I appreciate you for it. I'm going to throw this one to Maria quickly. Where else is ranked choice voting already used?
Well, ranked choice voting is used at the municipal level in a dozen or so cities in this country, including Minneapolis and St. Paul, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Portland, Maine has had it for a while, San Francisco, Oakland, San Leandro, and Berkeley in the Bay Area, Santa Fe. There's a few others, and there's a whole list of cities that are waiting to implement in the next year, and we might be able to add a few more to that list soon, including Albuquerque. It's happening, perhaps. And then it's used sort of like, at the state level, it's used in Maine as of 2018, and it's used internationally. There's, New Zealand uses it. There's a number of countries that use it at the national level. So it's not new, and it's not even radical. It's just, it works.
So there's a really interesting question here that I'd like to dive into, and it's saying we were talking about moderation, and we were talking about finding consensus. And somebody says, does a system like ranked choice voting reward mediocrity? Does that put us in the middle? Does that not give us our best? What are some thoughts on that? All right.
No, go for it.
No, I think Evan and I are going to say the same thing, but I'm sorry, but he'll say it better, so I'll go first. I think that, I just a strong believer in this. I think it is easier to reach people, to appeal to their anger, than it is to their aspiration. It is much easier. That is a simple thing to do. We're seeing it every day in our politics, not from skilled people, but from mediocre people who have an ability to, find a way to get you aggravated. And in our polarized election system, all you have to do is find a way to convince somebody to be angry at the other side. You don't have to convince them you're going to do a damn thing for them. You're just going to keep them from having to be hurt by that person across the aisle. But something that I say all the time, I said, look, I believe, part of why I'm passionate about this is, I believe that if I could flip out of my coffin at the end of the century and look back and say, what was this century defined as by historians? I think the chance is it would be defined as the decline and fall of liberal democracy. And so we have to find a way to save the system. Now, to get to people's aspiration, you need to be able to put something together where they can put their anger aside. Because one of the things I tell people, if you want to appeal to anger, just look at history. Every person who rose to the leadership ranks of the French Revolution lost their head. Because it's easy to get up there and say, the other guy's terrible, let me do it. But when you don't deliver, it's just more anger and more anger and more anger. So to bring together people and get them to aspire to achieve something instead of just be angry at the other person takes so much more than mediocrity. It takes a lot more talent. But if you're going to do it, we need a system that allows those people to emerge, because we have a system where they don't have a choice right now.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great response, and I'll answer just in a different way. But look, I wouldn't. First of all, I don't equate moderation with mediocrity. I don't think that's right. I don't think that's fair. But more importantly than that, I think I personally, and I'm not sure any of us used that word moderation on the panel, but I certainly don't, and I don't prefer to think of it that way, and that's not actually, I think, the right word. The right word is unifying, and that's the word I use, and unifying isn't mediocrity, and it isn't necessarily moderate. I mean, we should fervently, there are many things we should be fervently fighting for, especially in this day and age where many of our foundational values are under threat. And I believe that we can and I believe there's common ground, that most Americans are committed to these values and that we can unite around these values. And so that's what ranked choice voting allows, not moderation, not mediocrity. It's unifying effective leadership where, you know, candidates are rewarded for listening to each other and listening to all voters, identifying, you know, again, I keep saying it, but it's so important, existing common ground, and using facts to have, you know, policy discussions that can lead to better policies, and I believe more, you know, a greater unifying effect. But that's what ranked choice voting is about, in my mind, not mediocrity, not even moderation.
I mean, what is mediocre are people who get elected with 25%. That's mediocre. And like I can stay nonpartisan. So I'm gonna do both. Like, let's talk about being mediocre. So when you get elected with 20%, right, you govern as though you were elected with 20%. And if you were campaigning to get to 50%, that is the opposite of being mediocre. That's actually, you're being less lazy than the person who had to get to 20% to actually win. The current occupier of the White House had a field of what, 15, 16 candidates 3 years ago? Currently, on the Democratic side, there's going to be what, a field of 15, 16 candidates?
30.
30? I mean, I'm sure some are not. I might be running. I'm a little young. I'm not quite 35.
What do we say? Go
One day.
Go for it.
One day. Woo! One day. But the point is that to say that even the people who are running for president right now, the 16, 17 people who are running to be the Democratic nominee for president right now should be falling over themselves to support ranked choice voting. They need to be our advocates nationwide to help pass this. Because it encourages more candidates to run, it actually changes how you campaign, and it makes you a more effective person when you're in office. So my plea to them, my plea to all of you, is that we actually pushed them on this. We actually have enough power in this room at this convention with Unrig and FairVote that we're able to push the presidential candidates for 2020 to support ranked choice voting. Do you think we have enough power to do that, folks? Do you think we have enough power to do that, folks? I think there might be some folks in back that want us to sign up to try to influence the presidential candidates next year to support not only fixing democracy, but specifically with ranked choice voting.
I'm going to actually choose to come after that. So, look, I think it's very important. There's one thing, because you're making a really important point, that I think if you look at what's happened in our country, before we were so polarized, when the majority of the country came to a point of view, Congress passed laws that reflected that point of view. We had that in civil rights legislation and voting rights and things of that nature. In the last 30 years or more, nothing that the population comes together and believes in gets passed as new laws by Congress. So there is an alternative that has come along, which is a state-by-state adoption of the things that the population now believes. And we've seen that with Mothers Against Drunk Driving and seatbelts. We saw it with gay marriage. We saw it with a lot of things that you couldn't get marijuana now, that you couldn't get through Congress, but you could get each state to pass it, and still there were enough dominoes where it started to really fall. But the point of that is, we'll talk a lot about in this convention. We have people, feet on the street in each of the places where we might be able to get ranked choice, because you need that. But every one of those campaigns had a great national awareness campaign attached to it, so that you get enough people to be aware that in their state they could have an opportunity to get the right to vote for people that they really care about. So what I'm saying is, we really need to make sure that not only do we do it locally, but we've got to get a wave going to have people in the country start to say, why aren't we doing that in my state or my city?
Well, that ruined my next question about local versus national.
Can I say something?
Of course.
I want to get back to the whole mediocrity issue. I think that, you know, the hardest thing to do, and many of you probably know this, is to build an effective working coalition, right? It takes so much work, it takes so much intelligence, it takes so much humility to do that. And that is what we need. We need a coalition-based governance, and that is what ranked choice voting asks of people. So, you know, it's the total opposite of mediocrity. You know, it requires excellence to be a coalition builder and a coalition worker.
Great answer.
So pivoting a little bit, you know, ranked choice voting isn't the only way that we could be voting. You know, there's a lot of different ways that we can change the system, and we're seeing that across the country. We're seeing different systems being passed in different places. We're seeing cities, states try different things out. And so I'm wondering kind of what's the take on that? How do we work together? What other systems are there? How does that work? And what can we be doing to, why here, and then where can we build together? I'll push that to Maria.
So I think people are somewhat in consensus agreeing that the system that we have is not really working out for us very well. There's a lot of brilliant people out there thinking of solutions, different solutions to perhaps the same problem, and I think that's wonderful, and that's, you know, part of why humanity is so great, is that people are brilliant and people try to figure things out. You know, we are here talking about ranked choice voting because the sort of like the solution that us on this panel have come to support as perhaps the best solution out there. There are many other solutions out there, and I think that that's fine. I mean, I think that whatever works for you, whatever you're passionate about, if you think that it's going to solve a problem, go for it. One thing that I will say, though, is ranked choice voting, you know, one of the reasons why for me it's the right solution, not only because of the things that we've talked about here, which some of the other models that are floating out there also address, is just the fact that it's sort of like tested and it works, right? And I like that. So that's partly why I'm supportive of ranked choice voting specifically. Also, because in my community, that is what people wanted, right? The voters voted for ranked choice voting, and it was my pleasure and my honor to help that policy be implemented, and now that's what we have. So, you know, if there's a different community that wants a different style, then, you know, go for it.
So I have a question here that piggybacks on something I was very curious about. So obviously there's a ton of different reforms that we're talking about at this gathering. There's all sorts of different things, and I think all of them are working together, right, in concert to unrig the system. So if you had to pick one other electoral reform plus ranked choice voting, so you get those two, what would you pick and why?
Me first?
No, I started with you last time. We're gonna start with Mike.
So I will obviously rank choice voting. Obviously, getting presidential candidates to support ranked choice voting, which I'm sure everybody in this room is going to do. But I actually feel like if I don't pay taxes, the government's going to find me, right? Everybody got to pay taxes because I got a social security number, meaning the government knows when you turn 18. Government knows where I live. Why aren't we implementing automatic voter registration in America? It makes no. I have to register to vote, but I don't have to register to pay taxes. I don't have to register to do anything else. But I have to register to vote. Doesn't make any sense. The government knows I exist. They know I live. Just like make it. I just show up and vote. So ranked choice voting, automatic voter registration.
Well, first of all, I would put that very high on the list too, but because Mike already gave a fervent pitch for it, then I'll turn to something else. But I agree. I mean, it's our constitutional right to vote. How is it that the government makes it more difficult for us to do that? I mean, it's just so not right. So I agree. Automatic voter registration is so critical and should be among the top reforms that we pursue. Another one that certainly deserves mention is gerrymandering and redistricting reform. I mean, that also is dividing us and pulling us apart and bad for competition and anti-democratic and small d democratic. It's just we've got to reform the way we draw our district and our electoral boundaries to allow, you know, the same people who are standing in elections to essentially to draw the boundaries in which they will run. You know, they're choosing. They don't choose us. We choose them, and that's the way it works. And that's why we've got to make that reform. So to restore democratic competition, better results, better governance, and so that more people's vote actually count in a more competitive system.
So I agree 100%. But the one other thing I think could actually be powerful on that would be voting from home everywhere. The notion that in today's world, people have to stand in line, they have to take time off from work, and a lot of people can't take time. So if we want more people to be able to vote, more voices to be heard, they should be automatically registered, but then they should be able to sit at home, vote from home, not have to give up a day's work. It's silly. And the other thing I think it would do along with ranked choice is it would allow people to be sitting at home in today's world looking up what each of the candidates are. Because if you think right now, when you only have two to choose from, okay, most people are going in already knowing who they're going because that's their party affiliation. But if you start saying to people, hey, do you want to do a little homework? Do you want to see somebody who's your second choice? Who is it? Okay, let me do a little homework. That's a lot easier to do if I could sit there and not have to think about it in the voting booth. So I think voting from home, the last thing I'll say about it, I thought long and hard about this. We really need the tip of the spear. I believe that ranked choice, if we could get it going, and we start to get more voices and that can get into Congress, then I think a lot of these other things will happen because the people will elect will want to see these things happen, and that's why I think we got to get behind ranked choice as the tip of the spear.
Well, I want to give a shout out to some of my colleagues from New Mexico here because we just got automatic voter registration and same-day voter registration. But in terms of a policy, that reform that I would like to see hand in hand with ranked choice voting, I'm very interested in making it easier and more attractive and appealing for people to show up and vote. I also feel very strongly that we need to make it more appealing and attractive for candidates that are community organizers, that are small business owners, that are moms, right, to run for office as well. And that is why I think that having really strong public financing laws is so important. It's so important, and those are hard to come by to, but that will get us to a much better place.
So, what do we do now? What's our next step? Where are things happening? Where do you think people, if they want to tap into this movement, what do we do?
Well, talk to any of us on this panel, for one thing. There's ranked choice voting advocacy groups in many of the states. Some folks are working to pass this reform at the state level. Some folks are working on more of a municipal level. Some folks are thinking about it for the primary system. So it is likely that there are people working on this and advocating for this in your state. This is a great place to be to find out who those people are. One of us can direct you in that way. But more than anything, just get involved. I mean, you don't have to do that much if you don't have that capacity. Everything that you bring to the table is wonderful and is unique and wouldn't happen without you. So if you're interested, just jump in. Do what you can.
Yeah, and I would just say, there are some great organizations that are pursuing this. RepresentUs is one. FairVote is another. Common Cause, obviously. My organization, Stand Up Republic, and its state organization is the same. There are other organizations that I think are interested too, but I don't feel as confident to speak for them. but there are many. United America may be one of them too. Can I get a head nod from a United America person in the audience? Okay, I think I'm kind of getting that. But there really are. There's so many opportunities to plug in and get involved in. And I would just say you can make a difference. Individuals can make such a difference. I look across the country and see some of the reforms that have been advanced in the last election cycle, whether it's in New Mexico or Utah or elsewhere. You know, usually you're talking about one person or a couple of people or maybe 3 people who decided, you know what, we're going to make a difference. And they started to lead on an important issue like the reforms we just got done mentioning. And people showed up to help because this stuff really matters. And to go back to something that Alan said, I mean, we are fighting for liberal democracy in our country and around the world. And liberal, I mean in the classic sense. And that we should all be able to get behind this, whether you're a conservative or a Democrat or an independent, and you know, wherever you are on the political spectrum, we should all be fighting for this. And it's not enough just to protect democracy. We have to improve it and strengthen it. And that's what this moment calls for, is for us to reach harder, reach higher, dig deeper, and to make our democracy stronger than it's ever been before. And the chance to do that is there.
Yeah, no, I'm going to be brief. I think 2 things is like fighting locally and fighting nationally. So I think locally there's a lot of brilliant people in the room. I'm going to learn more from you than I feel like I've spoken in the last hour. But Gene Massey, one of our leaders from FairVote, Minnesota, the leader of FairVote, Minnesota is in the house, who delivered ranked choice voting in Minneapolis and St. Paul, a vast ocean of knowledge. And I would also say we need to go national, and we need to start amplifying this to people who live in Iowa, people who live in New Hampshire, start amplifying this to folks who can take this campaign national, and that's the people who are going to be in the White House next year.
Yeah, look, I agree with all that, but I would say, look, everybody should do, I believe, you know, we're all up here because we've gotten to the point where we feel it's so important. We're joining boards, we're doing things, we're hosting events, okay. But look, everybody, the main thing we could do is everybody leaves this room and says, now when they go out into their communities, they're going to start a conversation about it because it can be so viral. Because if you look at the nature of political discourse today, bottom line is, if you just talk to people and once they get out of, most people, if you ask them, why did you vote for that person? The first thing they tell you are the horrible things that of the other person is. What was I supposed to do? Vote for that moron? So they never talk about the positive reasons they voted for any candidate. And then that gets people really upset because you just talked about my candidate is a real idiot. And in fact, in today's, you know, what you find is when they ask families, what's the one characteristic that you would not want your son or daughter to marry somebody that has? The number one answer today is somebody from the other political party. And that is the number one answer. And so what you have to do is say, hey, let's stop and think for a second. How did our system get us here? And if you start the conversation, wouldn't we all rather have more choices than just somebody we hate versus somebody we'll accept? And wouldn't that be a good thing? Well, that can't be done. Well, yes, it could. Have you heard about ranked choice? Have you done it? So I really think this could go viral, and then people like this guy are going to get it to go national.
So very quickly, if you are a leader in the ranked choice voting movement in the room, could you raise your hand very quickly? Look around. These are your people. Meet them, talk to them, get involved with them, support them. And then throughout the rest of the weekend, we're going to continue this conversation. So we have master classes on how to build and win ranked choice voting campaigns. We have a master class on what to do once you win that campaign, because it's a whole new story. We also have an event tonight hosted by Ranked Choice Tennessee, your local ranked choice group at the Flying Saucer from 6 to 8. So I want to encourage all of you to join into this movement, talk to these people, learn more about this, and then take that conversation home with you. All right. And Mike wants to lead you in just a brief exercise.
I mean, we'll figure out if this works. We were gonna try it, and I thought no, and then we're just gonna try it. We're gonna just do it.
Yeah.
So in Minneapolis, Ward 5 is like all like majority black people. So we're gonna just pretend like this is the room right now, right? So if you're able-bodied, can you get on your feet? More choice and more power, ranked choice voting. I say more choice, you scream out more power. I say more choice, you scream out more power. Ranked choice, is that it? There we go. Ranked choice voting gives us more choice.